June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. The sea was calm, a deceptive calm, the kind that comes before history cracks open. Above the blue horizon, streaks of rising sunlight reflected off carrier decks painted with the red Hinomaru. Japan's proud fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steamed eastward. The Imperial Navy had ruled the Pacific for 6 months. Every opponent crushed, every carrier sunk or burning. The rising sun appeared unstoppable. But then faint silhouettes appeared on the horizon. American aircraft denied dive bombers and torpedo planes, descending through the clouds like avenging ghosts. Japanese lookouts shouted warnings. The officers froze. Among them, a single thought echoed. Impossible. Those ships were sunk at Coral Sea. Yet there they were. The Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet returned from the depths. Engines roared, bombs fell. And in that moment, the hunters of the Pacific realized the hunted had come back. The ocean that once belonged to Japan was about to change hands forever. The Pacific War began in fire. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched the most audacious surprise attack in modern military history, Pearl Harbor. In less than 2 hours, Japan crippled America's Pacific Fleet. Battleships burned at anchor. Smoke rose over Ford Island. The U.S. Navy's pride, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, lay broken in the mud. To Japan's high command, it was proof that their vision of a new empire was unstoppable. The Pacific was vast, but now it seemed theirs. With the United States reeling, the Japanese expanded across the map, seizing Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Every victory added confidence. At the heart of Japan's triumphs were its aircraft carriers, fast, lethal, and precise. The age of the battleship was ending. Naval air power was the new emperor of the seas. The Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, was the most powerful naval air armada in existence. It had written history at Pearl Harbor and now pressed its dominance into every corner of the Pacific. By early 1942, the Imperial Navy fielded 6 frontline carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Each carried dozens of A6M Zero fighters, D3A Val dive bombers, and B5N Kate torpedo bombers, the deadliest trio of aircraft then afloat. Together they projected power across thousands of miles. In contrast, America's surviving carriers were few: Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, and Saratoga. They were outnumbered, outexperienced, and operating on the defensive. But they carried one advantage Japan never fully appreciated: industrial resilience. While Japan celebrated, the United States began rebuilding. Damaged ships were patched, crews retrained, and production lines ignited with furious speed. Yet in the first half of 1942, the Pacific remained a Japanese lake. The next confrontation would come at the Coral Sea in May 1942, the first battle in history where opposing fleets never sighted each other directly. Aircraft, not guns, decided the outcome. The Japanese intended to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, threatening Australia. The Americans intervened with Lexington and Yorktown to stop them. For 2 brutal days, both sides launched waves of aircraft in search of each other. The sea became a chessboard of smoke and fire. When the battle ended, Japan had lost the carrier Shoho and suffered severe damage to Shokaku. The Zuikaku's air groups were decimated, but for the Americans the price was high. The USS Lexington was lost, torn apart by secondary explosions and flames. The Yorktown limped back, her decks twisted, hull leaking, engines struggling. To Japanese reconnaissance she was finished, a total loss. This was the moment of Japanese overconfidence. Tokyo Radio celebrated another decisive victory. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff believed that with Yorktown destroyed, the US Navy had, at most, 2 carriers left to fight, not nearly enough to challenge their next grand operation: the capture of Midway Atoll. Midway, a small coral outpost halfway between Asia and North America, was of immense strategic value. control of it meant control of the Central Pacific. From there, Japan could threaten Hawaii directly. The Operation MI would be the hammer that crushed American resistance once and for all. The plan was elegant, but flawed. It assumed the Americans were still broken, that no carrier could rise again so soon. It was a fatal underestimation of American resolve. Because while Japanese planners celebrated their victory, US Navy engineers in Pearl Harbor's Dry Dock No. 1 were performing a miracle. Yorktown had been estimated to require 3 months of repairs. Admiral Chester Nimitz gave them 3 days. And somehow they did it. Riggers, welders, and machinists worked around the clock without rest. Sparks lit the night over Oahu. Metal was patched, bulkheads reinforced, fuel lines replaced, radar recalibrated. Every man knew what was at stake. Midway would be the next blow. By June 2, 1942, just 4 weeks after being sunk at Coral Sea, the USS Yorktown sailed again. Battered, limping, but alive. And she was not alone. Enterprise and Hornet steamed beside her, carrying the same determination that had been forged in the fires of Pearl Harbor. Far across the ocean, Admiral Yamamoto's fleet was already underway, confident that no American carrier could possibly stand in its way. But beneath that calm Pacific horizon, fate was preparing a different answer. In a small, dimly lit room on the island of Oahu, far from the roar of engines and smell of oil, a handful of American codebreakers worked in silence. They belonged to Station Hypo, the US Navy's cryptographic unit. Their leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been studying the intricate lattice of Japanese naval communications for months. Every intercepted signal, every coded phrase, every repetition. They logged it, dissected it, and rearranged it like pieces of a puzzle. By early May 1942, Rochefort and his team had a breakthrough. They discovered that the Japanese were preparing for a massive operation against a target designated only as AF. But what was AF? The Japanese believed their codes were unbreakable, and for the most part, they were right. But human error, not mathematics, would be their undoing. Rochefort's team devised a trap. They instructed Midway's communication station to send an unencrypted message complaining of a water shortage. Within hours, Japanese intelligence transmitted an encrypted report to their fleet. AF is short of water. The secret was out. AF was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, now knew Japan's target. It was the break the United States had been waiting for, a chance to set an ambush. But even with the advantage of foreknowledge, the balance of power remained grim. Japan's Kido Butai still outmatched the Americans in aircraft, pilots, and ships. Their carrier crews were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and the Coral Sea. Their coordination and precision were legendary. The US carriers, by contrast, carried exhausted air crews, untested replacements, and a sense of grim urgency. They would be fighting outnumbered again. Yet, in the shadow of that imbalance lay something the Japanese could neither measure nor anticipate. American resolve combined with industrial speed. At Pearl Harbor, Yorktown's miraculous resurrection had inspired the entire fleet. Damaged air wings were reformed. Pilots from Lexington were reassigned to her decks. Mechanics patched bullet-riddled planes with scavenged parts. Every crew knew they were sailing into what might be the final stand in the Pacific. On May 27, 1942, Nimitz gave the order. Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17, Yorktown under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, would take position northeast of Midway. Their orders were simple: ambush and destroy the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, the Japanese armada under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was a masterpiece of naval might. More than 200 ships, including 4 heavy carriers, 11 battleships, 24 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. Their confidence was absolute. Intelligence had told them the Americans were broken, their carriers destroyed or scattered. Yorktown was known to be sunk. The rest were assumed too far away to intervene. The plan was bold and complex. First, a carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would attack Midway to draw out any remaining US ships. Once the Americans revealed themselves, Yamamoto's main fleet, trailing hundreds of miles behind, would deliver the killing blow. It was a strategy that relied entirely on surprise, but surprise unknown to them no longer belonged to Japan. In the final days before the battle, the Pacific became a stage of silent anticipation. Midway's airfields buzzed with activity. B-17s and PBY Catalinas were readied for reconnaissance. Pilots studied maps covered in pencil marks and oil stains. Every man knew the odds, yet none retreated. On June 3rd, US reconnaissance aircraft spotted the approaching Japanese invasion force. The radio crackled across the fleet. The enemy had arrived. Aboard the Yorktown, sailors stood at their stations. Many still bore the grime of the Pearl Harbor docks. The steel under their boots was freshly welded. She was a ghost ship come back to life. Patched, scarred, but defiant. That night, as darkness fell across the Pacific, both fleets steamed toward destiny. The Japanese believed they were about to finish the war they had begun. The Americans believed they were about to change it. And when dawn rose over the horizon of June 4, 1942, neither side knew that within 24 hours the course of the entire war would shift and that the Japanese Navy would come face to face with the impossible. The ships they thought were gone had returned. War changes men faster than it kills them. The sailors and aviators who boarded the Yorktown in late May 1942 were not the same men who had fought at Pearl Harbor. They were veterans of loss. Many had watched their ships sink, their friends vanish beneath burning oil. They had seen America humbled. Yet on that steel deck, surrounded by the smell of paint, sweat, and salt, something had hardened within them. A shared defiance. Every rivet hammered into Yorktown's patched hull felt like an act of vengeance. Every sunrise drill reminded them that survival was no longer enough. They were fighting to prove a nation's endurance. When Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor, she carried more than aircraft. She carried the spirit of redemption. Her decks bore the ghosts of Pearl Harbor and the hands of the men who had rebuilt her. The Japanese believed the ship was gone. The Americans made sure she would return stronger than before. This was the human paradox of the Pacific War. The more Japan tried to break America's will, the stronger that will became. And in the silent hearts of those aboard Yorktown, there was no doubt. The next battle would not be fought for territory, it would be fought for the right to stand again. In naval warfare, knowledge is the rarest weapon. Admiral Yamamoto's plan for Midway was brilliant on paper, a complex strike designed to lure the Americans into a trap. But it was built on a single assumption, that the enemy could not possibly know his moves. That assumption was already shattered. By intercepting Japan's coded messages, Admiral Nimitz had transformed intelligence into strategy. He placed his 3 carriers northeast of Midway, far beyond Japanese reconnaissance range, perfectly positioned for ambush. When Nagumo's strike force approached the atoll at dawn on June 4th, it found itself shadowed by unseen enemies. The Americans, silent and patient, waited for the perfect moment. Their air wings were divided into squadrons, torpedo bombers flying low, dive bombers circling high, fighters escorting both. The Japanese carriers focused on attacking Midway's defenses had their decks cluttered with refueling aircraft and armed bombs. The trap was inverted. Yamamoto had not lured the Americans. The Americans had lured him. This reversal of tactical momentum, from hunter to hunted, was the essence of the battle. It wasn't luck. It was calculation, risk, and the courage to act on incomplete knowledge. When the first American squadrons launched into the wind that morning, they didn't yet know they were flying into the jaws of history. They only knew that the time for hiding was over. Japan's early success in the Pacific was built on technological mastery, the Zero fighter, the precision of carrier operations, the seamless coordination of air wings. Yet the American carriers that returned at Midway proved that technology alone could not secure dominance. Yorktown was an engineering miracle in motion. Her repair crews had accomplished the impossible, rebuilding a nearly crippled ship in 72 hours. She carried a fully operational flight deck, radar-guided fire control, and reinforced anti-aircraft batteries that had been upgraded during repairs. Each system represented a lesson learned from defeat. Damage control procedures were rewritten after Pearl Harbor. Fire suppression systems improved. Pilots drilled relentlessly to adapt their tactics against the agile Zeros. The Americans learned fast. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy's technology had plateaued. Their planes remained lethal, but their industrial capacity could not replace losses at the same pace. Their carriers were masterpieces, but fragile. Fuel lines ran exposed. Bombs were stored below deck in tight quarters. When hit, they burned like torches. At Midway, the reappearance of Yorktown was not just symbolic. It was technological proof that America could absorb punishment, repair and return, faster than Japan could comprehend. To the Japanese observers who later sighted her in the distance, the realization was chilling. The enemy they thought destroyed had learned how to outlast them. The human, tactical and technological dimensions were converging toward a single inevitable collision, a moment when preparation, intelligence and endurance would meet fire and chaos on the open sea. That moment was now racing toward them. Every battle is a test of machines, but the real contest, the one that determines the outcome, is fought between the minds commanding them. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was no ordinary officer. A Harvard-educated strategist, he understood America's industrial strength and feared its long-term potential. His goal had always been swift victory, meant to cripple the United States before it could fully mobilize. Yet even Yamamoto could not resist the momentum of his nation's success. After Pearl Harbor, Japan's high command demanded another decisive blow. Yamamoto planned Midway to destroy America's remaining carriers in one strike, to end the Pacific threat forever. But his plan was too complex, his fleet too divided. His confidence in surprise blinded him to the possibility that the Americans had already broken his code. Across the ocean, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz commanded from Pearl Harbor with quiet determination. His leadership style was simple but unyielding. Trust your men, use intelligence, and never underestimate your enemy. While Yamamoto relied on flawless execution, Nimitz relied on adaptability. He delegated command at sea to Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Admiral Raymond Spruance, men who had never worked together before but who shared the same relentless calm under pressure. Their strength lay not in arrogance, but in humility, a willingness to act despite uncertainty. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew the Japanese fleet was coming. But they also knew something the enemy did not: where and when that fleet would arrive. That single edge, born of intellect and restraint, would change everything. While the American fleet prepared for its desperate stand, the Japanese Navy steamed toward Midway wrapped in absolute confidence. Their carrier air groups were the most experienced in the world, veterans of the China campaign, Pearl Harbor, and the Coral Sea. Their pilots considered themselves invincible. In their eyes, the Americans were amateurs, reckless, slow, and predictable. Reports from intelligence confirmed what they wanted to believe. The Yorktown was sunk, and only 2 enemy carriers remained. This belief shaped every decision Admiral Chuichi Nagumo made. On the morning of June 4, 1942, as his planes struck Midway Island, Nagumo received conflicting reports. An American carrier had been sighted. He hesitated. Should he launch a second strike on Midway, or rearm his planes for a naval engagement? His decks became chaos, bombs being loaded, unloaded, refueled, switched. The carriers that had been the sharpest instruments of Japanese power were now cluttered with confusion. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance aircraft shadowed them unseen. Their positions were being transmitted directly to Admiral Spruance. Nagumo still believed he was the hunter. He didn't know that the hunter had already taken aim. That blindness, the inability to imagine that the enemy could recover so quickly, was the fatal flaw that doomed his fleet. Confidence had turned to complacency, and complacency in war is death. There is a kind of silence in battle that has nothing to do with sound. It's the silence of realization, the moment when an army or a fleet understands that the war it thought it was winning has turned. For the Japanese Navy, that silence would arrive at Midway, when reports began to filter back that the Yorktown was not sunk, that American dive bombers were overhead. Disbelief rippled through the command rooms. Officers refused to believe it. Impossible, they thought. The Americans could not have repaired a carrier so quickly, but there she was. The reappearance of the Yorktown was more than a tactical surprise. It was a psychological wound. To the Japanese, who prized precision and planning above all, it shattered the illusion of control. To the Americans, it symbolized something entirely different: the rebirth of hope. The ghost carriers sailing into battle became the embodiment of resilience. Their presence alone demoralized the enemy and inspired those fighting beneath the stars and stripes. War is not only fought with weapons, it's fought with will. And at Midway, the American will proved indestructible. The stage was now set. Two fleets, one believing itself invincible, the other reborn from the ashes, were about to meet in the open Pacific. The next hours would decide who ruled the ocean and who would never recover. June 4th, 1942, 0430 hours. The Pacific sky was a pale blue-grey, heavy with clouds. On the horizon, the first light of dawn caught the decks of 4 Japanese carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Engines roared. Crewmen rushed across steel decks, fueling aircraft and arming bombs. The air was thick with fumes and salt. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's strike group prepared to launch its first wave. His orders: destroy Midway's airfields, neutralize resistance, then wait for Yamamoto's main fleet to finish the job. The attack began at 0436. Dozens of Val dive bombers and Zero escorts lifted into the sky, their shadows flickering over the waves. At Midway Atoll, US Marines braced for impact. Bombs fell in patterns across the runways, craters erupted, and anti-aircraft guns barked defiantly. By 0700, the Japanese believed the island was crippled. But Midway was far from silent. The defenders, a mix of Navy, Marine, and Army pilots, scrambled what planes they had. Outnumbered, outclassed, yet unbroken, they climbed into the sky to face the incoming waves. Many never returned. But they brought something far more valuable than survival: time. That time was all the US carriers needed. To the northeast, hundreds of miles away, Task Forces 16 and 17 steamed in radio silence. Aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance studied the enemy's course. Every update from reconnaissance narrowed the Japanese position. At 0700, the sighting report came in. Enemy carriers sighted, bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. Spruance didn't hesitate. He ordered a full strike. On Enterprise and Hornet, flight decks erupted into controlled chaos. Engines sputtered to life, propellers chopped the air, and pilots climbed into cockpits heavy with heat and nerves. Many were barely 20 years old. Meanwhile, aboard Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher, coordinating from a ship that should have been rusting in dry dock, read the same message. The ghost carrier prepared her squadrons for launch. She was battered, her hull patched, her systems temperamental. But she was ready. By 0830, over 150 American aircraft were airborne, searching for an enemy fleet that still believed itself invisible. The Japanese, for their part, faced a deadly choice. Nagumo's first strike group had reported that Midway was damaged but not destroyed. Another attack would be needed. Yet even as Nagumo prepared to rearm his planes for a second strike on the island, scouts reported something terrifying. Enemy carrier sighted to the northeast. Nagumo froze. He could not attack both Midway and the American fleet at once. He ordered his flight decks to be rearmed, bombs meant for land targets replaced with torpedoes. The process was chaotic. Fuel lines snaked across decks. Bombs were stacked in hangars, unsecured. The Japanese carriers, the pride of their navy, were now floating powder kegs. Then, at 0920, the first American attack arrived. Torpedo Squadron 8, 15 TBD Devastators from Hornet, came in low, barely skimming the waves. They never stood a chance. The Zero fighters dove on them like hawks. One by one, the slow American bombers were torn apart. Every plane was shot down. Only one pilot survived, Ensign George Gay, floating in the sea as the battle raged around him. But even in that slaughter, the Americans had achieved the impossible. The Japanese fleet had been forced to maneuver, scattering its formation. Fighters had descended to sea level, chasing the torpedo planes. The sky above was now wide open. High above the clouds, the real strike was arriving. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, squadrons that had been lost for hours struggling to locate their target, suddenly spotted the Japanese carriers below. Through breaks in the clouds, the glint of sunlight off flight decks betrayed their position. The Americans rolled their planes into steep dives, altimeters screamed, bomb bay doors opened. At that instant, fate itself seemed to tilt over the Pacific. The sunken ships had found their revenge. The Japanese still believed victory was within reach. They did not yet know that in the next 5 minutes, their entire carrier strike force, the same that had devastated Pearl Harbor, would cease to exist. The tide of the Pacific War was about to turn forever. June 4th, 1942, 10:20 a.m. For hours, the Pacific had been a chessboard of misdirection and sacrifice. Now at last the pieces aligned. From 20,000 feet, the dive bombers of the Enterprise and Yorktown squadrons broke through the clouds. Below them, the Japanese 1st Carrier Striking Force. 4 massive ships, each with its deck crammed with fueled aircraft fully armed, ready to launch. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bomber group. He had been searching far longer than fuel reserves allowed. One more wrong turn and they would have had to ditch into the sea. But just as hope began to fade, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding north, Arashi. It was racing to rejoin the fleet after chasing a US submarine. McCluskey followed its wake. It led him straight to the Japanese carriers. That single decision, a flicker of instinct, would change the course of the Pacific War. At 10:22, the Enterprise bombers rolled into their dives. Below them, Kaga's deck was chaos, planes armed with torpedoes, refueling lines snaking across the steel, and crews running between stacks of ordnance. They never saw the danger above. The first bomb struck amidships. Then another. In seconds, Kaga became an inferno. Flames leapt from deck to deck. The heat detonated fuel and torpedoes. Explosions tore through the hangars. The mighty carrier, pride of the Pearl Harbor attack, was now a rolling fireball. Moments later, Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, came under attack. 3 bombs were dropped. Only one hit. But that single bomb pierced her flight deck, ignited the hangar below, and detonated torpedoes stored inside. The explosion was so violent, it lifted sections of the deck into the air. Nagumo's staff barely escaped before the bridge became engulfed in smoke. To the east, Soryu suffered the same fate. Dive bombers from Yorktown descended through the smoke, their bombs hitting the carrier squarely. One struck near the forward elevator, another amidships. Fire tore through the ship like wind through dry grass. Men jumped into the ocean to escape the inferno. In just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were mortally wounded. Below deck, Japanese sailors fought to contain the flames. Pumps failed, magazines exploded, fuel poured into the lower decks. The ships that had once ruled the Pacific now burned so intensely that the rising smoke could be seen for miles. Admiral Nagumo stood on the deck of a cruiser watching his carriers burn. The shock was absolute. 6 months earlier, his fleet had bombed Pearl Harbor, sinking America's battleships. Now the same nation he thought crippled had struck back from the sea, with ships he believed destroyed. But the battle wasn't over. From the west, the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched her counterattack. Her planes spotted Yorktown and dived in, determined to avenge their fallen comrades. Bombs struck home. Flames spread across Yorktown's decks. The ship listed, smoke pouring into the sky. Yet the crew, disciplined, calm, fought the fires, brought the systems back online, and prepared for another airstrike. For a brief moment, it seemed Yorktown would survive. But Hiryu's second wave found her again. Torpedoes tore through the hull. The ghost carrier that had returned from Coral Sea was finally silenced. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Yorktown drifted in the water, listing heavily, but her sacrifice had not been in vain. That afternoon, the Americans struck back once more. At 17:00, bombers from Enterprise and Hornet located Hiryu. She launched her last planes in a desperate attempt to defend herself. It was too late. Bombs fell in succession. Flames ripped through the flight deck. The last of the Japanese carriers, the final sword of Nagumo's force, erupted in fire. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, were burning wrecks. Japan's elite aviators, its finest crews, its most experienced pilots, gone in a single day. As night fell over the Pacific, the horizon glowed red. American pilots returned to their carriers in silence, exhausted, stunned by what they had witnessed. They had done the impossible, not through numbers, but through courage, sacrifice, and a stroke of fate. In less than 24 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost the core of its striking power, the same force that had once seemed invincible. The Pacific was no longer theirs. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the world could breathe again. The smoke still hung over the water as dawn approached on June 5th. The Americans began to realize what they had achieved, and what it had cost. The aftermath of Midway would reshape the Pacific War forever. The morning after the battle, the Pacific was eerily calm. The sun rose over drifting oil slicks, burning wreckage, and thousands of survivors clinging to debris. The proud carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the same ships that had once darkened Pearl Harbor, now lay beneath the waves. American reconnaissance planes circled above, capturing images that would soon stun the world. 4 Japanese carriers gone, 1 heavy cruiser crippled, over 250 aircraft lost, and more than 3,000 sailors dead or missing. In contrast, the US had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and around 300 men. The ratio was staggering. Never before in naval history had such a devastating reversal occurred in a single day. For the Japanese, the loss was not just material, it was spiritual. The carriers destroyed at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, had been the core of Admiral Yamamoto's Kido Butai, the world's most powerful naval strike group. Each ship carried Japan's best pilots, men trained since the 1930s, forged through years of combat in China and the Pacific. They were irreplaceable. Japan's rigorous pilot training program took years, producing only a handful of elite aviators annually. Now hundreds of them were gone. The Imperial Navy had gambled everything on Midway, and lost it all. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the carriers, was devastated. He withdrew in silence, his fleet now broken, his confidence shattered. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles away, received the news via coded message. He reportedly stood motionless for minutes before whispering, "The war has turned against us." In Tokyo, news of the defeat was initially concealed. The public was told of a tactical victory with minor losses. But among the officers of the Imperial General Staff, the truth was clear. Japan's naval supremacy had ended in a single blow. The empire that had spread across the Pacific in 6 months would now spend the rest of the war retreating. For the Americans, the mood aboard the surviving carriers was complex. There was elation, yes, but also exhaustion, grief, and disbelief. Pilots who had flown through storms of anti-aircraft fire returned to find their friends missing. Deck crews worked through the night, tending to the wounded, clearing the decks, counting the aircraft that would never return. Many stood on the flight decks at sunset, staring at the orange horizon still faintly lit by the burning wrecks of the Japanese fleet. They had won the battle, but at a cost few could fully comprehend. On June 7th, as the last fires died out on the water, US search planes spotted survivors from the sunken Hiryu. Among them were burned, oil-slicked men, some singing patriotic songs as they floated. American ships approached carefully. Many Japanese refused rescue, choosing instead to sink beneath the waves. For those saved, the shock of defeat was unbearable. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz received the first full reports. The scale of the victory stunned even him. In a quiet statement to Washington, he wrote, "We have accomplished more than could ever have been expected. The enemy's offensive power has been crippled." But behind that calm tone lay the weight of sacrifice. Every name on the casualty lists reminded the US Navy that victory was fragile, earned in smoke, fear, and chance. The ocean that had once echoed with the roar of Japanese dominance now belonged to neither side. It was a graveyard, silent, vast, and stained with oil. And yet, amid the wreckage, the balance of power had shifted. From this moment on, Japan would fight not for conquest, but for survival. The United States, bloodied but unbroken, now held the initiative. In Tokyo, silence filled the corridors of the Naval General Staff. The coded reports from Admiral Yamamoto arrived in fragments, each message darker than the last. By June 10th, the truth could no longer be hidden. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers destroyed, 1 heavy cruiser lost, over 100 of the Empire's most skilled aviators gone. To the men who had once engineered Pearl Harbor, this was unthinkable. The rising sun, which had shone so brightly over the Pacific, now flickered under clouds of doubt. Emperor Hirohito was briefed personally. The official communiqué softened the blow, describing severe losses, but not their full extent. Yet Hirohito, ever meticulous, demanded the complete reports. When they arrived, the reality was staggering. Japan's carrier fleet, once 6 strong, was now reduced to 2 operational ships. The Empire's industrial base could not replace them fast enough. Each new carrier required years to build, and Japan lacked both materials and fuel. The loss of so many veteran pilots compounded the disaster. In their place would come hurriedly trained replacements, brave but inexperienced, who would never match the precision of the men lost at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto himself, architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, was overcome with guilt. He had predicted this outcome before the war even began, famously warning, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." Midway came almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prophecy had come true. Across the Pacific, in Washington, the atmosphere was transformed. For the first time since 1941, the Allies had reason to hope. When the telegrams from Nimitz reached the White House, President Roosevelt reportedly smiled for the first time in months. The American press called it "Revenge for Pearl Harbor." Headlines declared, "Japanese Navy crushed at Midway." But inside the US Navy, there was no gloating. Nimitz and his commanders understood that the victory, while decisive, was only the beginning of a long and brutal campaign. Japan still held vast territories: the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The Pacific would demand more blood, more ships, and more courage before the tide would fully turn. Still, Midway changed everything. It ended Japan's ability to wage large-scale offensive operations. It forced the Imperial Navy into a defensive posture from which it would never recover. Every subsequent battle, from Guadalcanal to the Marianas, would now be fought on American terms. Strategically, Midway proved the power of intelligence, air superiority, and carrier warfare, the triad that would define modern naval combat. No longer were battleships the kings of the sea. The era of the aircraft carrier had arrived. Emotionally, the impact was just as profound. For the men who fought there, Midway was more than a victory. It was vindication. A message carved into the ocean itself, that America's spirit could not be drowned. In the months that followed, US naval construction accelerated. New carriers, Essex, Lexington, the Seine, and Bunker Hill, began launching from American shipyards in an unstoppable stream. While Japan mourned what it had lost, the United States was building the force that would end the war. By 1943, the US Navy had tripled its carrier strength. By 1944, it ruled the Pacific. The empire that had attacked Pearl Harbor with the cry, "Tora, Tora, Tora," now fought only to delay the inevitable. Midway was more than a battle. It was a hinge, the point on which the entire Pacific War turned. From that morning on June 4th, Japan would never again launch an offensive across the ocean. And for the sailors, pilots, and officers who had survived, the memory of that day never faded. Some spoke of the smoke, some remembered the faces of friends who never came back. But all of them knew. They had witnessed the moment the Pacific changed forever. The ocean remembers. Long after the flames died, the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rested silently on the seabed, steel tombs beneath miles of dark water. The currents still whisper through their broken hulls, carrying fragments of the battle that decided the fate of the Pacific. Midway was not a story of invincibility, it was a story of resilience. Of a nation struck down at Pearl Harbor rising again from its own wreckage. It was the triumph of intelligence, courage, and chance, three forces that together altered the course of the world. For Japan, Midway marked the beginning of the end. For America, it was the first step toward victory, a proof that innovation, endurance, and belief could overcome even the mightiest enemy. But beyond strategy and numbers, it was a story of men. Pilots diving through storms of flak, sailors battling fire and fear, and commanders making decisions in moments that would echo for generations. In every war, there comes a point where destiny shifts, where empires pause and history chooses a new direction. Midway was that point. It turned the tide not just of the Pacific, but of the century itself. Today, the sea above the Midway battlefield looks peaceful, blue, endless, indifferent, but beneath it lies the memory of fire, and the lesson that even the most powerful can fall when arrogance blinds them to resilience. The Japanese Navy was shocked when the American carriers returned from the depths, but in truth they had never truly sunk. Not in steel, not in spirit. They had simply waited for their moment to rise again. And when they did, the Pacific would never be the same.